Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode is part 2, in which I review what therapists fight about. This is based on a post on the therapist subreddit by Rebsosaurus. They posted a meme from Facebook that had a bunch of topics that would get therapists fighting amongst themselves. And I want to start today's part 2 with the topic of self-disclosure. That's one of the items on this meme that therapists will fight about. And yeah, therapists do fight about this. But the general consensus I find to be more powerful than the other side. So it's sometimes helpful when reviewing these items, for me anyway, to break it up into 4 categories with right and wrong-headedness of the pro side and right and wrong-headedness of the anti side. So if we start with the right-headedness side of the self-disclosure, pro-self-disclosure, which, by the way, is my position, is that research, like abundant research going back decades, shows that appropriate and effective self-disclosure does enhance outcomes among clients in general. And as long as you follow the 3 elements of effective self-disclosure, then generally speaking, it will not only be okay, but it will actually improve outcomes across the board, regardless of what you're working with a client about. And the 3 elements are, off the top of my head, are keeping it as brief as possible, right? You don't want to take up the whole session. Also, making sure that what you're self-disclosing about is related to the topic at hand, that you're doing it in the service of the treatment plan. You're doing it in the service of the client instead of just randomly self-disclosing. The third element is that you have processed this part of your own personal life sufficiently so that it doesn't come out in a very busted up way that distracts the therapy to yourself, that it doesn't cause the client to worry about you. It doesn't give the client unease watching you kind of process and suffer. Now, that doesn't mean that self-disclosure doesn't involve crying. You could, for example, self-disclose about the grief you experienced when your grandmother died and tear up a little bit. That's okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it pulls the client to worry about you or to focus on you instead of themselves, that kind of thing. So those are the 3 elements. And when you follow those guidelines, generally speaking, again, not only is it not harmful, but it actually is helpful. So to refrain from this sort of self-disclosure is to ignore the power of it. Now, for some therapists, they don't like to self-disclose just for personal reasons, which is fine. But generally speaking, most good therapists that I work with in my circle are comfortable with self-disclosing about a certain set of topics in certain situations. And again, as long as it's relatively brief, that it serves the purpose of the therapy, and that it isn't, and that it is processed enough by the therapist so that it doesn't come out in a very busted up way. My dogs are barking. I don't know if you can hear. I think there was a delivery to our house. That's usually what they're barking at. So that's the pro right-headed side. The wrong-headed pro side, I guess, could be characterized by people that have very poor boundaries and are just self-disclosing willy-nilly and at length, and just believe that, look, that's just my style of therapy, is I'm just very loose or something. And it doesn't take a genius to understand that that's a problem. Okay, so the right-headedness on the anti-self-disclosure side will point to the wrong-headedness side of the pro and say that, look, therapists who self-disclose too much are a problem, and that has to be reined in, right? And therapy isn't about the therapist. It's not an opportunity for the therapist to process their feelings and use the client as their own therapist. So therefore, self-disclosure should be avoided, that sort of thing. So that's the right-headed side. It's still short-sighted because of what I said earlier, but it's at least pointing at something that is viable, right? It's a viable critique of some self-disclosure. On the wrong-headed side of the anti-self-disclosure will be people that will literally say that it's unethical to self-disclose. I can't tell you how many times I have heard therapists say this, or even clients, that across the board, it's unethical to self-disclose. I've even heard students who have told me that other professors have said that. And I just think, what world do you live in? And, that's just stupid and wrong-headed. All right, this next item on this meme is harm reduction. Oh boy, yeah. Do people fight about this in my field? So if you don't know, in a very off-the-head way of explaining this, because I've done no prep for any of these items, so it might come out a little funny, but I feel like I live in this world enough to be able to speak off the top of my head. So with harm reduction, the pro people will say that the idea of abstinence, whether it be with alcohol or other substances or a habit like gambling or something, that not everyone benefits from an abstinence-only model. And harm reduction should be included in the repertoire of ways that we approach addiction and problematic use. And for those people that are on the pro side, they will say often that for themselves, the 12-step model didn't work, the abstinence model didn't work. It actually just created this cycle between, trying to refrain and just white-knuckling it, and then they would relapse. Whereas if they just have a harm reduction model where, for example, with someone who suffers from alcohol addiction or problem alcohol use, they find that it is possible for them to have a drink now and then, as long as they keep it under certain circumstances. And they have to be very buttoned up about making sure that they don't go down the slippery slope. And they will even say that the slippery slope metaphor is wrong-headed in that it doesn't always apply. Whereas in the 12-step program, the culture tends to err on the side of abstinence and assuming that any movement towards use will result in a slippery slope that will cause you to eventually be in a world of hurt, that kind of thing. And the reason why, from my outside, because I'm outside of that debate, I mean, I understand both sides, really. The reason why a lot of people are very upset about the harm reduction model is that in the addiction world, even in the clinical world, a lot of people come from addiction either themselves or they had family members. And they've seen firsthand just how destructive the habit can be, whether it's gambling or spending or alcohol or cocaine or heroin or sex or pornography or something. And what they have seen from experience is that one of the phases of recovery is that people will bargain with the abstinence in a way that won't be good for them, in that they'll say, I think everyone understands the process of denial. So you might, let's say if we just stick to alcohol, that someone hits bottom and they realize that they need to stop drinking. And so initially they refrain, but 6 months in, they're at a party and they're just like, what's the big deal? I mean, I can have one drink. It's not going to end my life. And so they have that drink. And then a week later, they have 2 drinks. And a month later, they have 3 drinks one night. And a month after that, they're having a 6-pack. And a month after that, they're drinking a glass of wine at dinner 4 times a week. And then a month from that, they're drinking 3 glasses of wine every night. And then a month from that, they're right back where they started and their life is falling apart again. And they look back in time and they say, I see what started this was the very beginning where I told myself, I didn't even drink yet, but I told myself it was okay to have one drink at one party. Or even it was okay for me to hold a drink and not even drink it at a party. Maybe that was the beginning of the slippery slope. And so they learn repeatedly, and there's a lot of people, sponsors and other people in addiction recovery that will say, yes, there has to be abstinence. You cannot drink. This is a disease, right? And so the thing you have to do is put all your effort into refraining and avoiding that first drink, because once you start drinking, then it's almost impossible to stop the cycle. So that's what works for them. And when you look at all the different options available, that mindset is the best for them. A very black and white, non-harm reduction way of approaching their recovery. But that is not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. So you will have people that will find that they can have a drink now and then. And even for them, if they refrain from drinking, it actually creates too much energy around it in various different ways that causes them to relapse in bigger ways. So for them, having a drink now and then actually helps them. Now, to say that among people that are in the world of addiction where they've been down that road so many times personally and they've seen so many of their family members and their friends also say that exact sentence of, I can have a drink now and then, it's not a big deal. They know from experience that that is the first step to horribleness. And so they have built up an almost dogmatic religion that says 100% of the time that is stinking thinking, that is addict thinking, that is being in denial. That is the road to horribleness. Don't even allow yourself to consider that having a drink now and then would be okay. And they apply it to everyone because for them, it often pans out that way. They will tell a friend that is in beginning of recovery, look, here's what I know, that because you're an alcoholic, if you allow yourself to even think about having a drink, then you are at the first phase of the slippery slope and your life will be unmanageable very, very quickly. And often that is the case. But what it ignores is the possibility for some people that it isn't a slippery slope. It isn't the beginning of the end. In fact, it might even be good for them to occasionally engage in that, whether it's alcohol or whatever other habit they have a problem with. So it's hotly debated because for harm reduction people to come along, it can actually cause a lot of harm. For people that, say for the group of people where the harm reduction model actually works for them, and they've seen it work for some of the people that they worked with. For them to start talking along those lines, then there's a group of people that actually need to abstain. That's the best model for them, who will say, oh, well, I'm being told by my 12-step program that I need to abstain completely. But there's this harm reduction model out there that says differently. And you'll have sponsors and family members that will hear the person suffering from the addiction start absorbing the harm reduction ideas. And even if the friends and family are wondering as well maybe harm reduction is going to work. And then they see that individual get influenced by the harm reduction model. They start using slippery slope. Their life becomes unmanageable. The friends and family also say, this harm reduction thing is stupid. It's harmful. It's propaganda. It's just another way of sucking people back into addiction. And harm reduction needs to go away. So I understand that sentiment, but it just is a short-sightedness within this debate that everyone's different. And it's sort of like when we were first dealing with COVID in the beginning, and we were perhaps overly cautious about social distancing and masking and stuff. And there was science coming out that was saying that there was some debate as to whether or not we needed to be that buttoned up about things. And there were people on my side of things that were saying, well, we can't tell people about that science because then they'll relax completely and they won't do any of the measures. And then people will start dying in more numbers, in greater numbers. And so we have to do the noble lie, as Plato put it, and say that the science is very firm that we need to do things and more. And it's kind of like that, where in order to convince people to stay the course and abstain, because, to abstain, there's little likelihood of harm happening to someone. You know what I mean? If you're going to err on the side or one side or the other, then it's much safer to err on the side that you as an individual cannot work within the harm reduction model and have it work for you. And so there's this general idea of within some people in chemical dependency treatment that will have that kind of attitude. It's like, look, I don't have time to figure out, and we don't have the luxury to experiment with that. We just have to be very hard-nosed that, no, the harm reduction model is stupid. Don't listen to them. You need to abstain, da-da-da-da. Okay. Even though these chemical dependency people know that harm reduction can work for some people, but they don't want to tell people that because they know from experience that 9 out of 10 times, the harm reduction model influence will just harm the individual because it'll kick the can further down the road of them actually achieving abstinence. You know what I mean? So and this debate has been extremely hot and heated for decades because this is a very real thing, and people's lives are very much in the balance. People literally will live and die based on whether or not they understand how they're going to recover from, depending on their approach to recovery and people, family members, and so this is very, very important to people. But on the harm reduction side, the right-headedness side will kind of speak the way I'm speaking right now, where they're like, yeah, I totally understand that for some people abstinence is the only way, and I totally understand that the harm reduction model being reported on could actually harm some people that probably shouldn't be within the harm reduction mindset. But then you have the wrong-headed side of the harm reduction side that will just rail on the 12-step program as this religious thing, and AA is stupid, and it's a cult, and you don't understand, and the whole, you'll hear people talk about AA and the chemical dependency industry as this like gaslighting scam, and those people, I'm just, what are you talking about? I mean, addiction is hard, and there aren't a lot of good options out there because it's a difficult thing, and to claim that a very helpful model, the 12-step programs, AA, this kind of thing, is completely bad because a lot of people who go actually don't recover. Whenever I encounter that, I'm like, okay, well, what other model do you propose? Because there's not a lot of good. There are other things that you can do. There are medical treatments like anti-abuse and other kinds of cutting edge medications. There are medications that will help people to disconnect the high that you get from alcohol or other drugs with anyway, it's complicated, but and those can all be used in conjunction with AA and that's, or at least with other kind of standard chemical dependency programs, and they are, and I've done that kind of work with people. But yeah, there's just a lot of almost religious fervor and about the way to approach addiction. And as an expert myself in addiction, I can tell you that there are certain principles that should be adhered to. I think you might hear it in my language, but there's fuzziness around the edges, and for some people, they are the exception, and that should be appreciated, within reason. Anyway, all right, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. Again, I want to remind people that if I'm saying something that is bothersome to you, which I don't know if that'll happen, it's hard for me to imagine because I feel like I'm presenting fair representations of various different sides to it, but I'm guessing I'll be off the mark in some ways because I'm biased, or I'm not being a completist regarding all the various different bullet points that are even in my head, let alone the ones that I don't know about. So feel free to chime in and offer your opinion, because I'm guessing that if you're a therapist, you have adamant opinions about at least some of these, if not all of these. And that's okay. We can disagree. Also, if you want to elaborate on the debate on your side of things, it isn't necessarily in disagreement with me. There's a good possibility if you were to bring up that bullet point, I would either say, oh, I didn't know that. That incorporates well into one side of things as I understand it, as I presented it. Or I would say, oh yeah, I totally agree with that. I just didn't have time, or I didn't think to bring that up. So, bringing up a point doesn't necessarily mean that it's in opposition. Sometimes people say, "Oh my God, I totally disagree with you," and then they'll proceed to say something that I'm like, "How is that different from what I was saying?" I mean, it's a different point, but I was, umbrella-wise, presenting that side of things, and you're just further elaborating what I was saying. So as I said before, just use your social skills. All right, so this next item is a bit in the weeds if you're not a therapist, but the item is reasonable group practice pay splits. So without getting too in the weeds, because I'm guessing most of you listening are not therapists, when particularly people are early career, but not always, then people are looking for various different ways to get clients and make money in this industry so they can start paying off their student loans, which are often quite enormous. And one of the things available, there are basically three venues that therapists can work post-graduation. One is to work at an agency where on the pro side, you have a steady paycheck. You don't have to pay your own taxes or your own rent or your own health insurance or your own vacation time. You also have a lot of colleagues that are right there with you. You have supervision that's paid for, blah, blah, blah. You have legal protections because the agency has lawyers, blah, blah, blah. And you have a steady client load because the agency is getting clients that aren't necessarily for you specifically, but they're for the agency, that kind of thing. On the downside of working at an agency is that you're paid often a fraction of what you would get paid in private practice, maybe 10, 20% what you would get paid in private practice at times. Like a typical agency job in Seattle would be about $65,000 a year, I think, maybe plus or minus 10 or 15,000, or I'll just say that. And in Seattle, the cost of living is such that is very hard, if not impossible, to live off. You probably have to live well outside the city, like an hour and a half outside, blah, blah, blah. Anyway. But the perks are significant, right? Like as I mentioned. And you get your hours for licensure eventually because you need a certain amount of hours supervision and clients. The other option is full private practice where you hang a shingle and you're starting a business and you're starting from scratch and no one knows about you and you have to build a client base and it takes time and it's risky and you never know what's going to happen and you have to market yourself. You have to get the word out. You have to be on your grind marketing wise, business plan wise. You have to pay your taxes. You have to pay for your own supervision. You don't get any vacation time. Once things ramp up, you can get paid a lot more money and you get to choose the kind of clients you work with typically. There's a third option though, which is kind of in the middle, but more towards private practice in that you can work for a group practice in which you typically work for another therapist who is senior and has too many clients. So oftentimes what happens is you have a therapist who has too many clients to work with all the, they're getting too many referrals. And so they start to hire these novice therapists to start soaking up their wait list. And they, as a quid pro quo, will say, look, novice therapists, what I'm going to give you is access to clients that you would not get access to normally. I'm also going to give you supervision. I'm also going to give you an office that you don't have to pay rent or anything. I'm also going to provide a fax machine and a computer or whatever, And so I will give that to you, but what you will give to me is a portion of all the fees. So the client, say, pays $150 for the session. I'm going to take 40% of that or something like 50% of that. And the general splits are that like 60-40 or 70-30 or something. I actually did this work, it was a group practice, I guess, in a sense, in that I worked for a small agency run by a therapist who had a contract with the state government. And she would get these contracts and then she would divvy them up among her stable of therapists. And in the beginning, and we would do in-home therapy. And in the beginning, the split was 70-30. I would get 70% of the revenue and she would get 30%. And over time, though, because I worked there for 10, 15 years, she started to shift to a 60-40 thing. But I was grandfathered in from my memory because that was the original expectation. And it could be argued that since I had been working there for so long, I didn't need as much oversight, and so it justified the lesser pay that she was getting. So the debate in our field often is around the novice therapist being upset at such a high percentage being taken out for the owner of the group practice. And yeah, for sure. But what I'm always thinking, being from a distant outsider who already has success in this business, is, well, then just open up your own private practice. Because that's the rub there, that that's the supply and demand kind of thing, right? At some point, the percentage becomes so high that the owner takes out of the therapist's pocket that it makes it unviable, and then it makes it worth it for you as a novice therapist to start your own private practice and suffer the consequences, but gain the benefit of being able to take the entire fee. You know what I mean? So the debate that I'll see online is people will just be railing at a business owner, at a therapist who owns a group practice, about these percentages. I can't believe, this one therapist took like 50%. And I'm like, well, then why are you contracting with them? You have a choice. You're not being forced to do it. Now, some people will say, I didn't have a choice because of my limited options. And yeah, but that's not the business owner's fault. I suppose if a group practice owner knew they were the only gig in town and they could just exploit all these novice therapists who live in town, then I guess. But even then, in today's world with online therapy, that doesn't really apply anymore so much. So that's that. But so on the side of the people that will be anti-business owner, I guess is the way to put it, is they will claim that the business owner is being exploitative, which absolutely can't. The other side to this is that you have some group practice owners that are absolutely exploitative and harmful and will penny pinch and will figure out ways to screw over their therapists. They will not give them what they agreed to give them in terms of supervision or in terms of clients, right? They might contract with them, and sometimes there will even be clauses in these contracts with the therapists that say that it's a non-compete, that they can't see clients at all or within a certain geographical distance of the group practice. And I've always had a big problem with that one because that is tyrannical to demand that your employee not do things on the outside that doesn't have anything to do with your performance as you do. It's sort of be like if you're working part-time for a grocery store, for them to demand that you can't work at any other job. Like you can't have a home hobby that, like you sell stickers online. Like you can't do that because the grocery store also sells stickers. It's just like you can't, there are certain human decency tenets that you can't break. And for a therapist to be on their grind. Now, what the group practices are often worried about is that you will scalp the clients from the group practice and say, you know what, I charge even less at my private practice. And yeah, you shouldn't do that. But I never hear therapists doing that. Therapists are very buttoned up rule followers. And so I don't see that. But to say that they can't hang a shingle across town, usually in a town, there's enough clients to go around, typically, as long as you're on the up and up and you know what you're doing. So I have a big problem with that one. In fact, I've told my supervisees who have been in that situation to either tell the business owner to fuck off on that particular clause of the contract, or to just go behind their back and see clients, because how would the business owner ever know? And if they ever did find out, you'll cross that bridge, and what's the worst they can do? They can just fire you from the group practice. Now, that's not great advice, but that's how adamant I am against that particular clause. I just find it to be ridiculous. But the fee structure makes sense to me, because you have a business owner that is spending a lot of money on rent and on supervision and on janitorial services and all the paperwork and legwork that goes into the leasing and the managing of the therapists and managing complaints and da-da-da-da-da. And it takes a lot of time. And I don't know if this is universal, but I'm sure it's not. But I think that if you're a senior therapist and you have built up such a good reputation, there's a dollar amount that I think that that's worth. And I think that that person deserves to be, compensated for the hard work they've put in for their brand. And you have all these novice therapists that have no brand awareness for their brand. And this senior therapist is letting this novice therapist draft in their brand's wake, if that makes any sense. And I think that has a monetary value in business. So I think that, but often the voice online anyway is from the novice therapists who are complaining about the exploitation, some of which is real, that I would absolutely get behind. But some of the complaining has to do with, I can't believe they're taking 40% out of my fee. I don't like that. And I'm thinking, well, then just don't work for them. Again, you'll hear from people that'll say, I don't have that choice. And I'll say, well, is that the group practice's fault? It could be the market's fault. It could be your fault for not being responsible, or it could be your program's fault for not training you on what you're supposed to do with your career. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my students in the last year talking about the nuts and bolts of what they're going to do precisely upon graduation, because that's where the rubber meets the road. It's like, okay, fine, I can educate these students, but if they have no viable way of actually having a career once they graduate, then what am I doing? All right, let's take a break. All right, this next item on the list is confusing to me. It just says Yalom, Irvin Yalom. I've actually had him on this podcast, and Bob really, really appreciates his work. And I do too, not as much as Bob does, but one of the very first therapy books I ever read was Irvin Yalom's book, The Love's Executioner, which to some extent hasn't aged incredibly well in some ways. But anyway, I very much appreciate Yalom. So I don't know what the idea here is, that Yalom, just the topic, will cause people to start arguing. I'm guessing what they're referring to, I haven't seen this, but I'm guessing it has to do with some people being so pro-Yalom that they don't have the ability to be critical of some aspects of what Yalom talks about and has talked about. And then you have people that don't like Yalom at all and will say that anyone who likes Yalom is stupid or something. I don't know. It's just my guess. Like in Love's Executioner, which is a very famous Yalom book and is often assigned reading for students. It was for me in my very first quarter. Me and Bob were in the same class. Bob and I were in the same program. We started at the same time, and we were assigned this book. And there's this one. It's 10 chapters, I believe, each about a different client. And Yalom talks about his own personal feelings as he's treating each client. And there's this one client, I believe, where he's body shaming the client, I think, a woman, and it doesn't age well to today's world. And I could see zealots of Yalom making excuses and being too positive and not seeing any critique in that. And then another group of people seeing that and being like, oh my God, you people are cult members or something. But I don't know. If you know about the debate, let me know. All right, so this next item, they just say astrology. So, yeah. Now, I don't know if this episode has reran, but I recently listened back to an old episode of ours and tagged it to be reran by Stacy schedules the reruns. And it has to do with parapsychology and astrology being a part of that episode. And I still stand by this approach and thesis, which is that I will support anyone's belief in whatever they want to believe in, generally speaking, especially the biggies like astrology or homeopathy or God or energy work or whatever, But to cross the line and say that there's scientific proof of these things is crossing the line to me, and is that's when I'm going to start to criticize. So if you believe in astrology that being born in a particular month or something will dictate your personality or your fate, then I will support that till the day I die. That's the American way, freedom of thought and expression and speech. But if you start using it as if it is science, particularly as a therapist, then we have a problem, because there are scientific-based, empirical-based, consensus-based, personality assessments and models that are, at least in design, trying to predict the future regarding behavior and interpretation of events. For people's personality will affect the way they interpret things and how they behave in the future. And that's what we're concerned with when we're trying to establish different types or aspects of personality, which is very, very hard. And there's a lot of debate as to whether or not that's even possible. But that's what we're concerned with. And astrology has been studied up and down, backwards and forwards for decades, thousands of studies. And there is no demonstrable predictive power or explanatory power of any astrology model, of which there are many. Astrology, the topic in and of itself, it's even hard to know exactly what one would be referring to, because it's, a collective of a lot of different people that look at it a lot of different ways. Some individuals have their own specific way of interpreting the star charts, but each one of those models does not pan out. So if you are a therapist, particularly if you're a goddamn professor, then you cannot talk about astrology in the same topic or the same way that you talk about the big 5 personality traits, or about the MMPI, or about psychoanalysis even, because these models have predictive power. They have a consensus around it, and the consensus around astrology is that it's not demonstratable. In the same way that we can understand that it's not demonstratable to say that God exists or that praying actually helps. There's been a lot of research on that as well, and has found that when it comes to things like prayer, if people believe, then things tend to work out. And there are plenty of studies, astrology or religion, that you can point to that will support the supernatural beliefs. But when you actually take it into consideration with the broader literature and the broader research landscape, those are one-offs that are either just anomalous findings, or they are obviously conducted by a biased researcher that was cherry-picking the data, or p-hacking, or some other nefarious research method to form the data to your belief system. So if you like astrology and you even use it in your life, even if you use it as a therapist, I will support. But you have to understand that it is a supernatural belief that has no basis potentially in reality. I could see someone using astrology as a way to help people, inspire them, right? Like for myself, apparently I'm Sagittarius, and if I had a therapist that said, well, as a Sagittarius, you have these qualities, and use them as a way to inspire me to identify with the better part of myself, then, that could be helpful. Now, it wouldn't work with me, because I would say, I know enough about the research on astrology that doesn't resonate with me. So I don't recommend you doing that with me, therapist. But if therapist and client both adhere to that or are open to that, it could be used in a very, very helpful, powerful way, which, that happens a lot. So it's a nuanced thing. Generally speaking, though, astrology should not be talked about among therapists as a serious endeavor, in the same way that Christianity should not be talked about as a serious thing. If a therapist were to say, I believe that you need to refrain from sin or else God will punish you, and you need to not have premarital sex or something. Like, it's the same thing. It's not supported by science. It's a belief system. And again, I will, to the day I die, support everyone's right, and I will never put anyone down for it. I mean, I have magical, supernatural beliefs. Absolutely. I have, I don't tend to talk about it, but I have absolutely a belief or a set of beliefs that are completely supernatural, non-scientific, silly, and philosophers have various different explanations as to why I and others have this belief that are quite compelling, meaning that I'm just deluding myself. And I understand that and even believe that to some extent, and yet I still believe in a certain thing. But I would never claim that it has scientific validity, and I would never fucking impose that on a client or use it as a way of framing my understanding of human psychology or of relationships or anything like that. It's just a completely different topic. I'm guessing I'm pissing everybody off, but let's move on. That brings me to halfway through the 20-item list, and I'm at the end of this episode. So I'm just going to go as brief and as fast as possible. So the next one is, I am so proud of you. So I think what this item is referring to is it okay for a therapist to say, I'm so proud of you to a client? And the debate, I think, is that for some people, they would say you are not their friend and you're not their parent and you need to keep it professional. And you also need to allow clients the discomfort of not having a therapist reassure them constantly. And all that is true. On the other hand, for some therapists and their style, saying something like that can be a powerful, helpful, very professional statement. I have made statements like that. Maybe not in those words, but it's not uncommon for me when I see a client, like a couple that has seemingly made some strides in terms of their giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. And I might, at the end of the session, because that's typically where this happens for my style anyway, I might say something like, hey, I just want to point out that I'm observing, when I think about where you guys were at 2 years ago, I am seeing huge strides and improvements since then. And although it hasn't completely eliminated the conflict, obviously, given what we talked about today, what I am seeing is that you are definitely giving each other the benefit of the doubt much more than you did originally, which is not only just a huge leap forward in terms of regulation, emotional regulation and differentiation and conflict management, but it's also an act of love to give your partner the benefit of the doubt when there's a voice inside of you doing otherwise is one of the most loving things you can do for your partner. So I see tremendous love here. Okay, end of role play. So, you can imagine that being helpful to hear. And that's a much longer version of I'm so proud of you, right? So, as with anything in therapy, there are very few rules aside from don't have sex with your clients. And it just depends. It depends on your style. So the next item here is Ozempic. And I don't know why this would be specific. So I see the debate about Ozempic online anyway, outside of the therapy world, in that you have a lot of people. So I'm guessing this is a sign of the times that in 10 years it'll look like a silliness of 2025, but it's a new drug. I don't know much about it. It is supposed to help with appetite. It has a lot of other side effects from what I understand, and it is being prescribed for people in legitimate ways, and it's also reportedly or rumored to be prescribed for rich people who can afford to get a doctor to prescribe it to them when they don't medically really need it, because they're basically just using it as a quick fix to lose weight. And there's a lot of resentment about that rumor, right? That once again, the rich are getting, and I could absolutely see that happening, by the way, but I don't know. So that's the debate that I usually see. Or I will see people railing on celebrities who seemingly have lost weight, and they will say, they're on Ozempic, as if they're being lazy or they're being privileged by getting access to a drug that everyone wants access to. I don't know. I don't know. So I'm guessing there's a similar debate within the therapist community, maybe specifically around eating disorders or something. But I haven't really seen that debate. The next item here is the no secrets policies. Yeah. So I also reviewed another episode that I tagged for rerun, in which I went into detail, and I've gone into detail on other episodes about this, but I know a lot about this debate, and I actually am in a minority position that I feel very confident in. But the history of this is that originally there was no need for a secrets policy because conjoint therapy, or therapy that involves more than just one person, wasn't really a thing. So as couple therapy and family therapy became advocated for and more prevalent in the 70s and 80s, there was this dilemma of, well, what if you see one or two people from the family, or you see one of the couple individuals, you see the couple individually sometimes, and you learn about a secret. Do you tell the secret to the other people in the family, in the family client unit? What do you do? Well, the original observation from early family therapists was that secrets were very destructive, because they often were. Now, whether or not it was the secret that was destructive or the thing that they were being secretive about was destructive, like if someone was having an affair, then the affair is destructive. Is the secret destructive? Like if the therapist upholds the secret, is that destructive, or is the affair, the affair is the destructive thing? The secret could be a part of it, right? But it's sort of like blaming the messenger to some extent. But and there's a lot of different types of secrets that one could hold, and it's one of those things that it just depends. And there's different approaches, and there's basically a choice between lesser evils. Because if a client, say, I'm seeing a couple, and individually at times, and this has happened to me, and one of the individuals, in one of the individual sessions says, I'm having an affair. Well, I have to choose from a number of lesser evils that I'm now facing. There's no good way out of this. There's no comfortable way out of this. I either have to keep a secret and risk alienating the other person if they do find out that I held this secret and betrayed that other client by keeping that secret, or I out the affair person, the cheating person, and risk, losing their trust and causing harm, and having the client end therapy with me right then and there. So, it has to be recognized that right from the beginning, there's no smooth answer to this problem. The problem is that someone is having a fucking affair. They are lying repeatedly to their partner, and as a therapist, that's not your responsibility. It's not your fault, and you're just going to have to do your best to try to help not only that situation, but overall. And there's different approaches to that as well. So as a supervisor that worked with a lot of couple therapists, because most of my trainees are couple therapists, I have a lot of experience lecturing and talking and overseeing these kinds of decisions. And so the recommendation is that a therapist has a policy established up front, and they can change it over time as long as they inform their clients thereof. But it needs to be even in their disclosure statement, and they themselves need to remind themselves of this policy, because it doesn't often happen, but it does sometimes. Take, for example, another scenario where you're seeing a family, and a teenager, a 17-year-old, discloses to you in an individual session that they are sneaking out at night and smoking pot with their friends, and their parents would be very upset about that. Do you just tell the parents? Do you just tell on the kid? Or do you conclude that it's better for the treatment to gain the teenager's trust, because you're actually trying to, because the teenager doesn't want to be in therapy and is looking for any excuse to not come? And would the parents actually want you to keep the secret because the parents actually want the teenager to bond with you? You know what I mean? Now, there's a lot of debate, and there's some legal consequences that can't be navigated well, because if you did tell the parents, the kid could actually sue you potentially and get your license taken away because you broke confidentiality. if you don't tell the parents and there's a consequence to the kids, say they smoke weed and they get in a car accident or something, not that that's likely, but it could happen, the parents could sue you and have your license taken away because you didn't tell the parents because harm was predicted. So there are scenarios where there's no way to know what even legally you're supposed to do. So that's the reality. So with the secrets policy, you just have to establish it up front, tell them sometimes repeatedly over time so that there's just no misunderstanding. So if the client, so for a therapist to have a no secrets policy, meaning that any secret they hear, they will immediately tell the other people in the family, in the client system, then that has to be reified and retold to clients because they might forget it upon hearing it in the first session, right? And it also needs to be verbally told to them in the first session, okay? Because that's, a pretty important detail that if they just read it in a disclosure statement, they might not pick up on it, or they might not even read that part because most people don't even read disclosure statements, okay? So if you are repeatedly telling your clients that, then if a client does tell you a secret, then you're going to sleep better at night knowing that, well, I told them at, the previous week about this policy. And so they either chose to forget or they subconsciously wanted the rest of the family to know. Otherwise, why would they tell me something that they knew I was immediately going to tell everyone else? Because I'm not going to participate in a toxic secret. Okay, that's the party line. That's not the consensus, but that is the typical way to approach it, and it's a very clean, easy way to approach it. It avoids a lot of headaches if you have that, and I recommend if people don't know what to do, they actually adopt that policy. My policy is also available to people, which is to say, I will keep a secret, not because I like secrets, but because I want people to be able to tell me their secrets. Because if they don't tell me, because if you have a no secrets policy, then people are never going to tell you their secrets because they don't want they don't want other people in the family to know. And so I consider it the lesser of the two evils by saying I will keep the secret. I won't, I'll talk with you about revealing the secret if I think it's important, or about dealing with the secret in a way that the other person would appreciate, like, ending the affair. But I will keep the secret. And here's my approach to that, and here's why I do it. And I tell people that. And my policy has paid off in that I've had many clients tell me things that they would have never told me otherwise, and have given me a chance to get my teeth into it, which I believe overall, in the long term, was better, and was better for everyone, including the person that didn't know about the secret, Now I have to deal with the fallout from that. Occasionally the cheated on partner suddenly realizes I've been keeping a secret from them for the past year, and they're betrayed and they're hurt and they're angry at me, and that happens. And then I have a rupture and I have to repair that. And that's why I will repeatedly with couples tell them that, here's my secrets policy and here's why, and just know that this could happen. And we'll deal with it when it does. And if you're hurt and angry at me, that's okay, and we'll work it out. And from my memory, I've always recovered from that rupture. And but it's a worthy payoff or a trade-off in that I heard about the problems and the secrets that I never would have heard otherwise. So what people will debate about in our field is sometimes from dogmatic places, where family therapists can sometimes be very dogmatic and say, like, secrets are always horrible and are always toxic, are always damaging. And okay, usually, yeah. But that doesn't mean that we have to have this policy of repeating the secret right away. What also doesn't help is that the major figures within family therapy, like Mnuchin and these other folks, tended to have this policy of the no secrets policy, and their style of therapy was this kind of radical honesty way. And so there's not a lot of models to follow to adopt what I do. So that's what I'll say about that. All right, so this next item is AI, artificial intelligence. Yeah, I see, and I'm sure this will be different in 5 years. I'm quite positive of it. But as of now, in 2025, and maybe more so in 2023, 2024, there is a very simplistic argument going on among therapists that I will giggle at, in that, so if I go off the 4 categories, the right-headedness of the pro-AI side is basically, I think, my position, which is that we don't know how AI can, or how effective or how ethical it will eventually be used, because we're at the very early stages of researching this. And it's continuing to evolve over time as the AI models improve, right? And so we just have to look, we have to refrain from using AI until we have the data to support its usage and the guidelines ethically thereof. But to just say that AI is always a problem 100% of the time, and even just acknowledging that it may be helpful in the future, not now because we don't have the data, to say that it's ridiculous to even research, or it's immoral to even consider it as an option in the future, is very wrong-headed. And that's the wrong-headed side of the anti-AI side. The wrong-headed side of the pro-AI side are typically tech bro kind of people, to stereotype, I suppose. You've seen them, I imagine, at least I have, these people that just think AI is literally going to solve every problem on the planet. And when you actually, and when they demonstrate it, it works perfectly. But when you actually, and I've done it, I've used AI, I've experimented with it in a lot of different ways. And I have found that AI is in terms of, May, I'm recording this, in May of 2025, AI has some seemingly miraculous functions to it, but it's extremely limited in a practical way. When you actually sit down and try to use it in the way that it's being purported to be able to be used, it is not useful. It seems like, this could be like my own personal assistant that would do everything for me, and it's like and maybe it'll get there one day, but it's not there now in my view. But there are some things that it does really, really well. Like one time I asked AI to brainstorm the title of an episode. I typed in, here's the episode, and I don't know what to name it. And I'm thinking about naming it something like this, but can you make it snappier and shorter? And, I told it to give me 20 different options, and it gave me 1 or 2 that were okay. And I said, I like these 2. Can you give me 20 more that are kind of like this? And then it gave me another list of 20. And I was like, I kind of like this one, but can you change that word for something else? And then finally it gave me a title that I thought was great. I'm trying to remember which title it was. But anyway, it can be really good for that. And I could have sat there for hours brainstorming different ideas by myself, and I never would have, I'm confident I would have been frustrated way earlier. And I never would have been able to come up with a title that was that as satisfying as that. You know what I mean? So, and to me, and for those of you who use AI, you're like, well, yeah, that's what AI does well. But to me, that's miraculous. I mean, there was a time when that just was not available to me, So there are some, really miraculous kinds of things. So the wrong-headed pro-AI side are the tech bro people that will just claim that AI, can be your therapist. That's the other thing. On the wrong-headed side of both sides, they will frame AI and its usage in therapy as only being that of providing therapy. But AI in both medicine and in psychotherapy, among researchers that are actually legitimately looking into it in an ethical way, are looking into how to help AI help the therapist or help the medical professional. You still have human eyeballs and a human clinician mind ultimately providing the treatment or making decisions. But the AI is there as a helpful tool in the same way that Google would be a helpful tool, right? Like if a client came to you and said, I have this disorder, and you have 5 minutes in between sessions and you're like, what? I don't even know what that disorder is. What is that? Or they talk about going to Burning Man and you don't know anything about it. And so you just Google, what is it like to go to Burning Man? And Google will search the internet and try to find something, a link that will help you out. You wouldn't say that the therapist is unethical for using Google. Well, AI can be used as another tool along those lines, like you could ask, I don't know if this would work, but you could ask AI to help refine your treatment plan or something, as long as it's confidential, blah, 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 and AI is not confidential at this point, but maybe eventually it would be, you know what I mean? So whenever there's new technology, therapists generally tend to be Luddites and resist. When online therapy, video conference therapy first started to be talked about 20 years ago, universally people were like, that's stupid, it's unethical, it'll never work. Today, you have a completely different landscape. Not entirely, but completely different. And the data is in that video conference-based therapy can be just as effective as in-person therapy. Now, there's individual differences. For myself, I don't like doing video conference therapy, and I don't, as a client, want to do video. I'm old. I hate it. Maybe if I had to do it, I would just do it. But as a professor, which is a related kind of thing of being teaching a class to a small group of students, 5 to 10 students, I'll tell you, I adjusted to video conference teaching, but I hated it, and I always longed to get back in person. And, I'm just an old person. So there's individual differences. And so there's that. But AI is just another thing that therapists will just immediately, without really understanding the landscape, just write off as unethical and a problem. Now, it might be a problem, but I think as a tool, it is too varied in its functionality for it to be 100% a problem. You know what I mean? Now, to talk about AI being a therapist for a client, on one side, the pro side will say, well, I, as a client, have been to 2 or 3 therapists and found some helpfulness in that, but I tried on a whim AI as a therapist, and it was better than any therapist I'd ever been to. Not only because it was there for me 24/7, but because it understood me better than my therapist ever did. You will hear anecdotes of that, just like you will hear anecdotes in various different things. That doesn't mean that it's going to work for everyone. In fact, I'm guessing it. I actually experimented with various different AI products in this way as well, and found it to be horrible. I found it to be bland and lacking any kind of soul, because it is bland and lacks any kind of soul. But maybe for some people, that's what they're looking for, or the AI just clicked with that person in a way that we sometimes will talk about, how you just need a good fit between therapist and client. So, that's what I'll say about that. And you'll hear pro AI therapist people saying, look, the vast majority of humans on the planet, like literally 99% or somewhere around there, do not have access to a therapist and never, ever will. So if AI can provide some help, then that's better than nothing, right? Well, we don't know if it's better than nothing. That's why we need research. I'm imagining that it could be designed in a way that would be better than nothing. Another way that people are thinking about using it is that as a therapist, you could make sure that the AI product has guardrails on it, and you use it as an adjunct to your therapy that you're providing a client. So the client can use AI. I could see in the future an AI, and maybe you have this already, that has like significant guardrails around it where it doesn't hallucinate and it doesn't tell people to kill themselves, because AI will do that. Because AI isn't thinking, it's just trying to predict what it should say next. And based on what's on the internet, based on what it's trained on, by the way. And so, but I could see a product coming out where it has been vetted and researched, and therapists will use this with particular kinds of clients. Like I could see it being helpful in CBT to help daily with clients, right? And the therapist would review all the chat log, or the AI would summarize it for the therapist at the next session. Like I could see that absolutely being helpful and very positive for client outcomes, right? And very lowering of costs and increasing of care to individuals. I could see that. I don't know that, but I could see that. So the debate of AI tends to be on the negative side and the wrong-headed negative side. But I don't know. And that's the thing. People say, no, Kirk, you don't understand. I heard about someone that was harmed by AI. That's not in disagreement with anything I just said. What I'm saying is we don't know. And there's a lot of different functional usages of AI on the table that have yet to be researched and yet to be developed. And those things could pan out or they could be a problem. But we shouldn't just write it off, right? Because there's so many benefits that could be realized. It could be democratizing. It could be, given to people that would never get therapy otherwise. It could greatly enhance therapy for everyone. It could greatly enhance the therapist's ability to keep track of things. It could help us write our notes. Like there's so many. Like I could imagine an AI bot that, again, was encrypted and was vetted and very buttoned up and might even listen to every session that you're having. And there's an agreement with the client that they understand this. And at the end of the session, the AI suggests a way of writing up the notes. And then as a clinician, you guide that and say, oh, no, don't word it like that. And the AI learns over time how to do that. And then for yourself as a therapist, in between sessions, you might interact with the AI bot and say like, okay, with this particular client, I'm kind of thinking this. And then the AI bot might have different therapy models that are incorporated into its data set, and it can say, well, have you thought about this? And then the therapist could be like, oh, I hadn't, and the AI bot could say, well, the client 3 years ago said this thing, and you never went back to it. Have you thought about that? And the clinicians could be like, oh my God, I totally forgot about that. Play me that bit of the tape again. And the AI goes like, okay, here's that section. Like, I could imagine that being incredibly helpful. I could also imagine it being a problem, right? That some company could start selling this shit as, data mining for marketing purposes or something, But if it didn't have that, then, and it didn't hallucinate shit, then I could see that being like a powerfully helpful thing. I mean, how many times as a therapist have you wondered about that sort of thing of just like, have we talked about this before? And I forget what she said about her mom, and I didn't write it down in my psychotherapy notes. What did she say about that? This, in long-term therapy, this happens all the time. So, or a client could have access to it and say, even after therapy had completed, the client could ask AI, when did my therapist give me advice about this? And then the AI finds that clip and replays that clip. And the client, 3 years after therapy is terminated, is greatly helped by being reminded of a powerful moment therapy. Just imagine that, And that's all AI based. So there's so many different possibles. Now, all of this could be a problem. We just have to research it and be open, but not use it until we fucking know. All right, I'm going to power through the last few here. The next item is, how long should someone be in therapy? I don't see people arguing about that one, but I'm guessing they do. And where do I begin? I feel like I don't need to get into this one because y'all know what I think. Can a therapist believe for them that it's best that therapy be brief and that they should be advocating for termination as soon as possible to not waste the client's time? Yes, if that's your approach, it should be well advertised before a client ever hires you that you're that type of therapist. And some therapists or some clients are absolutely looking for that kind of thing. They don't want to be in long-term therapy. And there's a whole tradition of brief therapy and collaborative therapy, solution-focused, narrative therapy. These are all considered brief therapies and have often the tenet of how do we get this client out of therapy as soon as possible. So, and I've done that kind of work in essence, in spirit, but not like as a purist. But I've worked alongside. I used to do co-therapy, meaning there were two therapists with a family, and he was a very staunch, brief therapist, and we worked well in harmony together. And I'm the sort of therapist that's completely open to either. I'm open to it being brief or open-ended. I've seen clients for 15 plus years and didn't blink an eye at it, because sometimes things take a long time. Anyway, so yeah, there's debate about that. And what you'll hear on the wrong-headed anti-long-term therapy group will say that to have therapy that goes longer than 6 to 12 months is always exploitative of clients, which is just ridiculous. It's like they just have no idea what they're talking about. The next item on this list is psychoanalysis. And yeah, I talk about this frequently in that on the wrong-headed anti-psychoanalysis side, they will say that it's outdated, that it lacks any scientific credibility, that it's sexist, and it's ridiculous because they'll point to like Oedipus complex or penis envy or something like that. And yeah, I mean, psychoanalysts of today are very aware and very critical of aspects of early Freudian theory. But contemporary psychoanalysis is one of the most complicated, most erudite, most philosophically sound therapy fields that I've ever interacted with. And I consider myself to be a relational psychoanalyst. I swim in those waters. I read those journals. I talk to those people. And it's way more complicated than that. And I find that on the wrong-headed anti-Freud, anti-psychoanalysis side, they are just overwhelmed by Freudian theory and they don't want to learn it. So they take a shortcut and just label the whole thing as stupid, so they don't have to learn it. Because that's, or they're just parroting what a professor told them because the professor didn't understand it. I've had colleagues, because psychoanalysis is so difficult to understand, and I've spent my entire career attempting to understand it, that and by psychoanalysis, I'm not even talking about like classical Freudian stuff, which is quite varied. He was very prolific over several phases of his own thinking even. But I'm also talking about like ego psychology and object relations. And Anna Freud, his own daughter, had a different kind of approach, Karen Horney, these kinds of people. So it's extremely diverse. And I find it to be the only model, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic model that really explains why humans in relationships behave the way that they do in weird ways. And attachment theory and schema therapy are related to this. Anyway, so what I will find is that they will just label the whole thing as being silly, whereas it not only has evolved over 150 years, but even the original Freudian work still has relevance today in so much of a way that a lot of people who are saying that Freud was an idiot are using Freud's ideas, and they don't even know they're Freud's ideas because Freud's ideas became so baked not only into our profession but into our culture that they no longer look like Freudian ideas anymore. So to say that Freud was an idiot is to ignore concepts like the unconscious itself or personality itself, or the idea of trauma itself, or recreations, or patterns in human behavior. I mean, these were mostly novel ideas, particularly as they applied to clinical medical work, because at the time that was just not even something that even people imagined was possible. Talking to people helps them. That's ridiculous. Freud and Joseph Breuer and Anna O, the Bertha Pappenheim, the first client, the famous client that they wrote about in 1880, those three people collaborated to invent talk therapy. And the client helped because she would say to Joseph Breuer, "It helps for me to talk with you." And Joseph Breuer was like, "Oh, it does?" And he would listen to her, and she called it cleaning the chimney or something like that, meaning it was cleaning out her mind. And so these three people collaborated to invent that talking can help people. So for a therapist to say Freud was an idiot is one of the dumbest things they could possibly say. Anyway, having said that, there are zealots of psychoanalysis that are religious cult members of Freud who ignore the obvious criticisms of some of their ideas. So there are wrong-headedness on both sides. All right, look at the last four here. The next one is diagnosing children. You'll hear people debate this, and this one also is really the thing about all these items is that when you really understand the landscape, there's legitimacy to both sides and simplistic wrong-headedness from both sides, as in any debate, political, otherwise, right? So with diagnosing children, generally speaking, we don't diagnose children because scientifically and philosophically and professionally, we understand that children change quite rapidly. And we also don't want to pigeonhole people. But this idea that the premise of the anti-diagnosing children camp will operate on an assumption that to diagnose means to harm. They'll say like, well, you don't want to stigmatize a child by diagnosing them. Well, by applying a label to anyone is not necessarily stigmatizing to them. It can stigmatize them because there are stupid people that will stigmatize someone. But for a therapist to think, I think this 12-year-old might have bipolar, is not to stigmatize them automatically. Stigma comes with it, but the therapist and the client are not inventing that stigma. And if the therapist does it right, they can protect people from that stigma. You know what I mean? So there's that. And there's also a lot of diagnoses in the DSM that are specifically for kids. So, they're that. The other thing is that on the wrong-headed anti-diagnosing children side, they will say, well, you're just pathologizing normal child behavior. And all I can say to that is, yeah, sometimes for sure. But have you actually seen an actual child with full-blown ADHD? Because if you have, you will understand that there's something different about kids that have full-blown ADHD. We need some kind of way of talking about that. We can't just frame it all as just normal rambunctiousness, because there is a rambunctiousness that's within typical ranges. But there's an atypical amount of rambunctiousness or an atypical amount of forgetfulness or working memory deficit or whatever, executive function problems. And we need some way of talking about, whether we talk about in ADHD terms or neurodiversity terms or executive function terms or working memory, whatever. We need some way of talking about that as clinicians, as researchers, as we talk with our clients and their families. And so, this idea of never diagnosing a child is really quite silly. Sometimes this comes into play when we're talking about personality disorders, and there are people that are diagnosing like a 13-year-old with borderline, and they'll talk about it as a budding borderline. And technically speaking, we don't diagnose minors with personality disorders, or maybe the cutoff might be 16. I can't remember exactly, but it's you have to be of a certain age. And it's not like as soon as you turn 18, suddenly you become borderline. People that have borderline or any personality disorder, in my opinion, and there's a lot of empirical data to back this up and anecdotal experience from clinicians and experts, that the person always had the personality disorder because the personality disorder developed in reaction to circumstances during their early childhood. It's just that it didn't have a chance to really show itself, or it might look like a normal teenage rebellion or something. So it's hard to detect early on, but it's easier to see later in life. And that's debatable even there. But now, having said that, there are overzealous people on the pro-diagnosing children side that will just diagnose kids with, it's a broader problem of just throwing out labels for everyone, including children, that are irresponsibly applied. That absolutely does happen in various different ways among various different diagnoses. But as long as it's done in a responsible, thoughtful way, in a tentative way, when I diagnose someone with something, unless it's really obvious, like in the case of major depressive disorder or something, or panic disorder, or PTSD, there are certain labels in the DSM that very much reflect reality. But there are, especially personality disorders, I always do that tentatively. I can be 5-10 years into treating client that on paper I've diagnosed them with a personality disorder that I'm still like, well, do they have that, or is it this other one, or am I just misinterpreting things, or are they below the threshold and they're within normal limits and I shouldn't be? Like, I always have that debate, and I have that luxury because I don't use insurance anymore, and so I don't have to report to anyone as to what the diagnosis even is. And so I can change it. I can have it as a tentative thing in my mind. I might not even include that in the notes in the official treatment plan. I'm always tentative. Anyway, next item on the list, life coaching. Yeah. So I recently did an episode on, and I've talked about this for the past 17 years on this podcast, but on the right-headed pro-life coaching side, you will hear people say, and I get behind this, they will say that some people aren't looking for therapists and they're looking for a more practical short-term thing. They might also never seek therapy because of stigma, and they're more likely to seek a coach. Also, we're facing a problem with not enough clinicians, and so some problems might be able to be treated by life coaches, and therefore to relieve some of the pressure from the mental health community might be helpful for everyone, right? So that's on the pro side, and there's probably some other pro ideas as well. On the wrong-headed pro side, they will say that they will frame life coaching as having invented brief practical therapy, which is not the case at all. They will say, therapists are interested in long-term and interested in pathology, whereas life coaches are interested in practical and strength-based work. And it's just like, who do you think invented the phrase strength-based? Therapists did. And therapists have been using strength-based techniques and ideas for decades. So shut the fuck up. And there's other things I could say along the wrong-headed pro-life coaching. On the right-headed anti-life coaching, which is me, is that on paper, life coaching is fine, but the way it's being used is exploitative and is essentially giving permission for non-clinicians to provide mental health services. That's not always happening, of course. There are absolutely responsible life coaches out there that know the line, but and adhere to it. As soon as the client starts getting into mental health topics, the life coach knows where that line is and says, "Oh, we can't talk about that," or "Let me refer you," or something. But anecdotally, anyway, the vast majority of life coaches that I experience have zero boundary about what they get into talking about. Some of them are explicit, even on their websites, talking about how they can help you with your depression or your anxiety or your trauma or something. And this happens all the fucking time. So not only that, but you also have a lot of therapists that are just avoiding legal consequences to their license by just switching to a life coach profession, but still basically advertising themselves and operating as a therapist, because as soon as they switch to life coach, then they can do whatever they want to, because there's no way to complain against a life coach because there's no regulation, there's no law. So generally speaking, the life coaching industry is a hot mess. And if it went away today, I would be happy. Again, is it being used legitimately and responsibly in my anecdotal minority? Yeah. But it's worth, and not only is it, a problem minorly, but it's a problem majorly. There are cases of major problems within, the Jody Hildebrandt thing, the Maurice Harker thing. This is a problem, and it's not getting better. It's just getting worse. The second to last one here is psychiatrists. So that's all they say. So what are they referring to? So just the idea of psychiatrists is causing therapists to fight. Well, why? That one is just the topic of psychiatry. That's stupid. Why would anyone fight against responsible psychiatry? That's dumb. Anyway, and then the last one is faith-based counseling. Yeah, this is similar to what I was talking about earlier, and I've actually worked alongside and supervised many faith-based counselors, and can absolutely appreciate, I'm more familiar having worked with those supervisees on how they use religion in their practice and how one can use it responsibly and not impose it and that kind of thing. On the pro side, which I absolutely will stand by, is that there are many people, in fact, most people, even in the United States, even in Seattle, which is one of the least religious places on the planet, particularly in the United States, most people frame their lives, generally speaking, through their religion. And therefore, when you're talking about their lives and their emotions and the meaning of life and their relationships, then framing it in their religious language and within their religious meanings can be very powerful and very helpful, and can be very democratizing, and can be living in the world of the client instead of making the client conform to the quote-unquote secular world of the therapist, right? So I absolutely stand behind that, and I myself, as a non-faith-based counselor, will, when I will assess that a client thinks very heavily within their religion, I will absolutely use parts, if not, dedicate most of the therapy to be framed within their religious language and meaning making. It can be very motivating to a client, to have God or Jesus or whatever model they're following to be a part of their healing journey, right? It makes sense. Or simple questions of, say I have a client that believes that Jesus is watching and cares. I could ask during a particular poignant moment, what do you think Jesus would say to you right now if Jesus could talk? Because, you believe Jesus is watching over you. What do you think Jesus would say to you right now? That can be a powerful intervention. And I will be surprised sometimes as to what people will say, So faith-based counseling, absolutely, 100%, stand behind it. On the anti-side, the right-headed people will say that a lot of faith-based counselors will impose, and they will. So I guess the right-headed anti-side is very critical of the wrong-headed pro side who will use it to impose on people, you know what I mean? And then the wrong-headed anti-side just hate religion and are heavily biased against religion in general, and think of religion as being inherently oppressive and inherently problematic and inherently shaming and stuff, and will, without knowing any specifics about the way the client or therapist thinks or uses religion, will just write it off as that. So that's the debate as I see it there. All right, well, I'm sure I pissed everybody off in those 2 episodes. And use your social skills. And feel free to comment below on YouTube or email in or whatever, or comment below on Patreon. And of course, take a deep breath and take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.